There was a Far Side cartoon that showed two spiders building a spider web across the bottom of a sliding board, obviously on a playground. And the one spider turned to the other spider and said, "Louie, I tell you, we pull this off, we eat like kings." I bring that up this morning. I know that might mortify some of you. Far Side could get pretty dark. I bring that up because in this passage from Deuteronomy 8, Israel is about to eat like kings. This is a wonderful passage for us to have at Thanksgiving because we hear here of the spread that God sets before Israel as Israel enters the promised land after years of slavery and wandering and manna and quail. God is about to give Israel everything that Israel had been promised, but before Israel can dive right in and eat like kings, Israel is told that they have to be humble, and humility is a tough sell. Again, Israel is about to eat like kings. They're about to take possession of the promised land, and they're going to build nice houses for themselves, and soon God's delivering them from slavery in Egypt and leading them through the Exodus may be the furthest things from their minds. Things will be so great in the promised land that if Israel stops from enjoying all these blessings, it'll probably be just long enough for them to pat themselves on the backs for those big houses they've just built themselves, those big houses they've just built for themselves. Now, before they can do any of this, though, Israel is told to be humble. And there's a reason for that. Be humble. God has just taught Israel about humility and about reliance for their own good, as God has delivered them from slavery. And while humility in and of itself is good, there really is a reason for Israel to be humble. There really is a reason for Israel to be humble, and that's so that they can remember. In verse 18 we read, "Remember the Lord your God, for it is he who gives you power to get wealth, so that he may confirm his covenant that he swore to your ancestors, as he is doing today." See, with humility and with remembering where we came from and how we got here, with this comes remembering the covenant that God swore to our ancestors, what God did for them, and what God does for us. We've already talked here and read here about what God does for Israel, but now let's talk about what God does for us. God gave Israel a covenant for the promised land, but God has given us a covenant for a kingdom. We may not have been part of the covenant originally, but we have been grafted into a new covenant through Jesus Christ. Our covenant may not include this promised land, but it includes salvation and the forgiveness of sins. Israel may have gotten to eat like kings as part of their covenant, but before that, they're told here to be humble and observant and grateful. Eating like kings may not be part of the covenant that God gives us in Jesus Christ, but still we're called to be humble and observant and grateful and giving. I think that we're called to be grateful, yes. I think that we're called to be appreciative. I think that we're called to appreciate, and I also think that we're called to multiply, to tell others about how God brings us into the kingdom and invites others to be part of the kingdom. I think that we're called to observe and to appreciate and to be humble and grateful, even if we may or may not eat like kings. We see that observance and that appreciation and that humility and that gratitude here when folks here serve mobile meals. We see that observance and that appreciation and that humility and that gratitude here when folks minister to our missing angels. We see all that here, that observance, that appreciation, that gratitude, that humility. We see that here when members of the church open our sanctuary to visitors from cruise ships. We see that here when we help at community meals, either as we did last week at Monumental United Methodist in Portsmouth or at St. Mary's Basilica over here in Norfolk or at Park Place previously when we did that. We see that appreciation and that humility and that gratitude and that observance here when we serve that way. We saw it, and we're seeing it right now in Dabney Baker. Dabney's not here this morning, but we're seeing it in Dabney Baker because last month, Dabney was one of us who went to a United Methodist Men dinner over at Bay Lake United Methodist Church, where their presenters were from Samaritan House and where they were talking about human trafficking. Dabney heard that only one person, a volunteer from Bay Lake named Pam, does all the shopping, all the grocery shopping for those survivors of human trafficking. So now there's not just one volunteer, Pam, who does the shopping. Now there's two, Pam and Dabney. Dabney volunteered to do the shopping as well. That shows that observance and that gratitude and that appreciation and that humility. We see this here in so many ways, and we probably have more ways that we can see it. We can see more of it come about as we continue to be humble and grateful and appreciative and observant as we continue to respond to what God did for us in Jesus Christ. Last Monday night, I went to a Virginia Beach police presentation on safety after the shooting at the church in Texas 2 weeks ago. And the officer who was talking was talking about his church, and he said at his church, they are told to give their talents, their times, and their treasure, their time and their treasures. And I was thinking, boy, this man's a United Methodist, isn't he? As he talked about how at his church they were called to give their talent and their times and their treasures, I thought, he is a United Methodist, isn't he? Because what are we called to give? We're called to give our time and our talents and our gifts. Well, it turns out that man's not a United Methodist at all. Time and treasures and talents, he gives those at a Unitarian Universalist church. Sounded like United Methodist to me from the way he described it, but that's what they give at the Unitarian church. Time and talents and treasures. And what we give here at the United Methodist Church, we give time and gifts and talents. So, there are times that we have to talk about giving, and this is one of those times. Today in this particular church, this is Giving Sunday, and this afternoon we have Charge Conference, so this is one of those times. For Charge Conference, we passed a budget, and in this budget, our projected giving covers only one-third of our expenses, with the rest being covered by the day school and perhaps by the Epworth Foundation. Folks, what can we do? What can we do? Think of giving, folks. What can we do? Think of what God has given us. What can we do? We're not the church we once were. With Charge Conference, we're probably going to see our membership slip to about 170 this year. Once, if you talk to Woodrow Brinkley, one of our missing angels, if you talk to Woodrow Brinkley, once this church was so packed that Woodrow and his family 80 years ago would walk over from Ghent for the evening service, because in the morning service you couldn't get a seat, and even in the evening service you had to sit in the balcony. We're not that church anymore. We're not that church anymore because there have been 70 members or so who have not responded to any correspondence from us for the last 3 years. Our membership is probably going to slide to 170 after Charge Conference today. Church, what can we do? What can we do? We are called to be humble and grateful and observant. What can we do? As we share church, what can we do? Being grateful for all we've received, church, for all we have, what can we do? What can we do? There's a reason we do what we do. There's a reason that we give and are grateful and are humble. There's a reason that we do this, church. So on this Giving Sunday, let's ask ourselves that, church. Church, what can we do? Amen. Thanks be to God.